Hi, everyone. For those just entering the webinar, I'm going to wait about 30 seconds to allow folks to join in, and then I'll proceed with the introductions. I guess it's taking Zoom a little while to let everyone in, as it is wont to do. It's kind of like popcorn. I can see the number of attendees joining on the Zoom, and you kind of wait for the attendee number to slow down, like you wait for popcorn to slow down popping. Looks like it's kind of slowing down now. Okay, good. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. And we have folks joining us from all around the world, which is wonderful. My name is Archon Fung, and I am the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I want to start with a few announcements on behalf of the Ash Center. The Ash Center would like to acknowledge that the land on which Harvard sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. This event is being recorded, and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel shortly after this event is concluded. Democracy in the United States and in many societies around the world is facing profound dysfunctions and inequities. In some of those societies, people are responding to those challenges by reworking their very constitutions, these foundational agreements of their governance structures. When many of us think about how constitutions get written and rewritten, we imagine some social elites, maybe political leaders or prominent jurists doing the work. But in the last 2 decades, many societies have tried to take seriously the idea that we, the people, should have a hand at writing as well as ratifying constitutions and constitutional changes. Some people have called this process participatory constitutionalism. As we'll explore a bit in today's discussion, the United States is somewhat exceptional in how rarely our Constitution is altered. The last really substantial change occurred in 1971, almost 50 years ago now, with the 26th Amendment, which reduced the voting age from 21 to 18. So several questions as we look around the world at other societies that have reformed, rewritten their constitutions. Why do other countries and other societies revise their constitutions? What are the problems they are hoping to solve by revising their foundational agreements? And then, how does citizen participation in constitution making work? Obviously, not everyone in a country can literally have a hand at rewriting. So what does it mean to aspire to we the people having the pen? Why not just have prominent politicians and jurists do it? Finally, one big concern about rewriting constitutions is that societies might open up a Pandora's box. Everything is on the table, and you could end up with a far worse constitution. For instance, one that punishes minorities or rewards authoritarians than you had before. How has that concern played out? We have a terrific panel here to explore these questions and many others, broadly the promise and many of the pitfalls of participatory constitutionalism as it has been practiced around the world. Here are our panelists. First is Erin Houlihan, who's a program officer at International IDEA. Erin works on constitution building processes around the world. She's the author of a recent report, Practical Considerations for Public Participation in Constitution Building: What, When, How, and Why. Pamela Figueroa Rubio is a professor at the University of Santiago in Chile. She has worked on constitutional reform in Chile for many years, including during the Bachelet government, and is now coordinating an observatory on the extremely important and interesting constitutional reform process that is unfolding in Chile right now. My friend and colleague, Joseph Kalt, is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School, and he is the co-director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. He has written, among many, many works, an important piece entitled The Role of Constitutions in Native Nation Building. And moderating today's discussion with special attention to the audience questions is Pedro Richeto, who is a democracy visiting scholar working with me at the Ash Center this year. You are welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of the event, but please, instead of using the chat, submit them via the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And that way we'll be able to collect them and process them more easily and get to everybody's questions, hopefully. Okay, Erin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Archon. It is a pleasure to be here and to see all of the panelists, and it looks like a great turnout so far, so thank you very much. Just to sort of set the tone, there's a couple of different issues to address. So the first would be the question of why constitutional change might be advisable or desirable instead of legislative or social change or some other form. And for me, it's helpful to think of constitutions as a kind of technology. Like all technologies, just because something was groundbreaking or really fantastic at the time doesn't mean that it remains optimal for all of eternity, or that it continue to effectively address modern problems and needs. So constitutions as a technology define the rules of the game. They're both legally, politically, and symbolically important because they determine who has access to political power and resources, who's recognized as part of the fabric of a country, which collective values we hold in common, whether and how rights and liberties are exercised and protected. And so this is fundamental. It shapes things. And as a technology, it's important to remember that constitutions are generally built by a past generation to regulate the future. So there can sometimes be a functionality gap. The benefit of this past future regulation is predictability and stability in law and institutions. Of course, we need this, but it also means that the interests, priorities, and power structures that operated in a past generation continues to bind people today and in the future. This is particularly important for older constitutions like the United States, since these were usually negotiated and written by a ruling class at the time. And as we all know, in the US, this was white landholding men sitting around the smoky room in Philadelphia. So the power structures and issues that they negotiated and were prioritized at the time don't necessarily apply forever. In some countries like post-apartheid South Africa and most colonial states, this issue of who wrote the Constitution can create serious legitimacy problems. So it's not just functionality, it's also legitimacy. And over time, as demographics change, values change, social needs change, the rules of the game then themselves might need to change to ensure that the Constitution continues to work for the interests of the whole society. A second issue to consider is, as Archon mentioned, how constitutional change is done and what that looks like today. The single biggest trend in the last 30 years or so is the role of the people. So of course, it doesn't mean that there isn't a smoke-filled room in the back where a group of 3 or 4 men negotiate the final content. That definitely still happens. But we are pushing globally toward participatory constitution building. And this is for both amendments and wholesale reform processes. It's a gold standard. There's no best practice approach. It's incredibly contextualized. It looks different in every single country, as it should. But just to flag a couple of reasons why this is desirable and quite beneficial, or we assume that it is, there's a fundamental right of the people to participate in governance, and designing the rules of the game is also part of that right. There's the normative proposition that public participation is a good in and of itself. And of course, there are instrumental considerations. Popular and political buy-in. So if everybody participates, you get this buy-in. And this can support effective implementation of the Constitution itself over time. It can mitigate infighting, both among the public and across institutions and politicians. It also is thought to support more democratic attitudes and behaviors among the public, which again, particularly in politically divided societies or post-conflict societies, this is a really important part of the process of constitution building. It's not just the text, but the way that it's done matters, the way that people are engaged, the fact that they're listened to, this legitimacy issue. And then there's this whole literature on democratic and peaceful societies and the contribution of the process of constitution building, public engagement, to this broader consolidation of democracy, to peace within a country. And then, of course, that leads to peace across countries as well. There's a lot of this that's still being tested on an empirical level, but this is really foundational to participatory constitution making. It's important to remember, of course, though, that despite its rise in popularity and its importance, public participation does not replace political or elite negotiations. That's always there, but public participation can help shape those negotiations. So just quickly, there's about 4 ways that this usually happens that the public engages. They can initiate constitutional reform either informally through protesting in the streets, and as Pamela will talk about, that was really a trigger for the current Chilean process, or formally through voting in a referendum to initiate reform, like in South Africa in 1992, or just voting for a political party that puts constitutional reform on the table. So it's initiation. They can also be electors of the constitution making body, whether that's the regular legislature or some specially elected assembly, which is also increasingly common. You see it again in Chile or in Tunisia. And then the big thing now in modern constitution making is consultations. So they're contributors of ideas about the text. People have a say on what the Bill of Rights provisions say, on judicial appointment mechanisms, on presidential term limits. It's a dialogue. And then, of course, as approvers of the constitutional text, most commonly by voting in a ratification referendum. And then a last issue to just touch on is there's often, and at least in US discussions, a concern about whether opening up a process for constitutional change can be a Pandora's box. That once you open this, every issue's on the table. It can be regressive, and that's certainly concerning, but it's not a particular concern that I've encountered. I don't think it's as big of an issue as we tend to make it in rhetoric, because like everything else, the scope of constitutional reform is negotiated. Those negotiations can be complex, they can be contentious, but at the end of the day, if people don't agree to the scope or the public doesn't support it, you revert to the status quo. There's no change. And only in cases where there's already problems in institutions, there's already weaknesses in our democratic structures, do we see sort of a hijacking of the reform process. And that, there's examples, Venezuela in 1999, Belarus in 96, Hungary in 2011, for very different reasons. But that's not an issue that I think we're facing in the US, and it's relatively rare. So thank you very much. Back to Archon or Pedro.
Thank you very much, Erin. That was excellent overview with a very nice structure for breaking down how we might think of the different roles of citizens in the constitution making and ratifying process. Let me turn it over to Pamela now, who can give us, Erin gave us a big overview. Pamela might be able to give us a deep dive into one, as I said, extremely important and fascinating experience that's happening right now. Pamela, over to you.
Okay, Archon, thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor. It is an honor for me to share the experience of constitutional change in Chile in this panel with such outstanding panelists and participants. And the first question is why the reform and why participatory? And I want to agree with Erin that in the case of Chile, it's because it is necessary to update institutions when the society change. We have a very different society now from the society of where the actual constitution was promulgated. In the case of Chile, the current constitution was promulgated in an authoritarian government in the 1918. And it was only possible to partially reform the constitution in 1989 and 2005 in the process of democratization of our country. But the constitution had an authoritarian conception of politics based on distrust toward politics and society. And that reason is, so in the Chilean case, you can see two reasons to change the constitution. It was the authoritarian origin of the text, but also because society changed. So we have a very different society now from 1980. And the second reason, I think that is because democratic legitimacy, the social consensus on institutions and their operation, I think that require participation and deliberation beyond the electoral participation. I think that the society in Chile now asks for different ways of participation, not just elections, but also different kinds of process. That is the reason why I think that constitutional change in Chile occur not just only because of the deep political and social crisis that we have today, but because of the need of legitimate the democracy of Chile from 10 years ago. I think that we started our political and social crisis. And when Chile started to define how to change constitution, in 2016, the President Michelle Bachelet at that time started a participatory process. But that process, it couldn't have the political agreement. President Bachelet asked the society, the civil society to participate, but the Congress and the political actors, they decided do not have a constitutional process. So that explains why the society in Chile had a very big protests and social movements in 2019. Because in the case of Chile, as I was saying, because we just can change some part of constitution in the last year, political and social actors demanded the constitutional change to unlock the authoritarian institutions. And it was very important to civil society not just reform the constitution, but have a process related to the new constitutionalism, as Erin said, that include the civil society participation in the process, in the institution that reformed the constitution, but also during the discussion. And I see that the issue that we are living now in Chile is very important to explain. Because in 2019, we have very social massive protests against the government and asking for equality, asking for no discrimination to different groups of the society. And just 2 years ago, it was October 25, we have a very big mass protest. After that protest, the political parties in the Congress, 11 parties represented in the Congress, decided to have a political agreement to change the constitution through a constitutional process. That agreement decided to have a national plebiscite to ask the people to decide if we can have a new constitution or not. And in that plebiscite, the 80% of the people vote to have a new constitution through a constitutional convention. That plebiscite was the October 25, 2020, just 1 year ago. So 2 years ago, the massive protest, 1 year ago, the plebiscite. It's a very historical day today for the process in Chile. And in that plebiscite, people decide to have the constitutional change through a constitutional convention elected through the people. Because in that plebiscite, we have another option to change the constitution through the constitutional convention mixed with the Congress and people elected. But the 80% of the people decided a constitutional convention elected by the people. And in that constitutional convention, for the first time in the history of Chile and for the first time in a constitutional process, we elected the constitutional convention with a gender parity law. So in the constitutional convention, we have parity. The constitutional convention was elected with a gender parity, and also we include for the first time in Chilean history a representation of indigenous people through special seats for indigenous people. It was around the 12% of the population of Chile is indigenous people, so we have that representation for the first time. That kind of election of the Constitutional Convention, because of the electoral design, it is very important for the legitimacy of the process. We have for the first time a constitutional convention that represents the Chilean society as is the Chilean society, with gender parity, with indigenous people represented, with political parties represented, and independent people represented. And that is very important to the legitimacy of the process, the inclusion of the new actors, but also now that we started to talk about the contents of the new constitution, we are going to include also mechanisms of citizen participation during the discussion of the Constitutional Convention. That means that we are going to have different kind of mechanisms like public audiences or citizens councils talking about the topic of the Constitution, and then we are going to include all that participation, all that civil participation in the final test, and at the end of the process, we are going to have a new referendum to people approve or not the new constitution. So we design a process that have many kinds and moments of citizen participation, and it is very important for the legitimacy of the process. So that's my start point. So we can, talk about this issue then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. That was an excellent overview. And for the kind of people joining the webinar from an American audience, from a US audience, there's a lot of news packed into what you just said, and a couple of novelties in the process that aren't novelties in Latin America, but are from the US perspective that I wanted to lift up is, first of all, the importance of descriptive representation, the provisions in the Constitutional Assembly that half of the participants need to be women and that there are reserved spaces basically for indigenous people. That those kinds of measures are very unusual, very rare, very, very seldom in the United States, right? And then second, you mentioned in passing the idea of lots of public hearings and lots of citizen kind of councils around where people would talk about the proposed constitutional revisions. And that kind of participation also is fairly unusual, especially at the federal level in the United States. So just wanted to point out those novelties and in order to facilitate the cross-border learning that is part of the point of this webinar. Thank you very much, Pamela. And now over to Joe. Joe, go for it.
Thank you, Archon. Well, let me begin by giving people just a little bit of a context. As I mentioned, I work with the American Indian nations in the United States, more than 574 federally recognized tribes who operate their own governments, perform almost every single function we would normally associate with state and local governments. their own courts, their own police, their own taxes, their own environmental policies, schools, housing departments, public health clinics, all the full array of state and local governmental functions. And we're at a point in history in which, beginning in the 1970s, under federal policies in the United States and followed not long after a little bit in Canada, the indigenous communities have been operating under policies of what are known as self-determination or sovereignty. And in that era, since the 1970s, we've been going through a fairly massive throwing off of colonial institutions by the tribes, by the tribal nations. Many, in fact, hundreds of the tribes in the United States, for example, had constitutions imposed upon them by the Franklin Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. Here you get to the 1970s and 80s, and suddenly you have the opportunity to govern yourselves for real, and you find out that those colonial institutions don't work very well because they're foreign in their structure, they lack legitimacy, they don't respect the indigenous cultural antecedents of legitimacy and power and authority in the community. And so we've been in an era of constitutional reform with scores and scores, if not hundreds, of our tribes in the U.S. and also in Canada rewriting their fundamental constitutions and structures of government. And the next, so that's the historical, if you will, context. The second thing about the context in which I work is cultural. With 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, we actually have representation of hundreds of different tribal cultures and concomitant ranges of economic conditions, historical relationships between themselves and their governing neighbors in the United States. And so we have a tremendous variety of cultural contexts, historical contexts, and economic contexts in which these constitutional reforms are now taking place. And we see every possible outcome of disastrous reforms. Fortunately, most of the reforms have been very successful because they've been driven from within by the leaders and the communities themselves. In thinking about today's session, I was trying to think about what do we see in the participatory process that seems to work and doesn't work? And what is the variety that we see? Because if the cultural contexts are different, then, for example, the forms of participation are going to be different, the forms of legitimate participation. Arkan, you just mentioned public meetings. I've got one mentor of mine, a tribal leader, who responds when I start mentioning public hearings to public hearings, why would we do what you white guys do? And the point being that the methods of communication and legitimate and deep communication about something as fundamental as your structure of government and your methods of collective decision-making are very culturally contextual. And I think we all need to be careful in our work. And as we think about this, to recognize that the preconceptions that we might all come to this kind of challenge with are exactly that. They're preconceptions, and they often may not fit. What do we see in the participation when I say different forms? I'll give you just a couple of examples. We have had examples of very successful constitutional reform being initiated by, in one case, a group of women that call themselves the founding mothers, because out of frustration with the status of the community, a group of women took charge, if you will, of a constitutional process, inspired the people, and brought the people into discussions, and led a process. Erin, I think, correctly mentioned, there's always going to be an elite. Otherwise, it's just mob rule. There'll always be an elite, but the issue that is important as we see it is what we see as successful cases of constitutional reform arise when a cultural, rather than a political or economic elite, when a cultural elite, that is people who are respected, male, female, elder, young, We see every variety in our contexts, but a culture elite emerges and enunciates the reasons for reform, provides ideas for how to reform, the structural changes that might be useful, and then engages with the community in their roles as cultural elites. And I'm using the word elite. I know it's a negative term, but I mean by that people to whom others look up and say, yeah, that's a wise person in our community. That's a wise woman. That's a wise man. That's a wise elder. Those are the kinds of individuals, when they get behind the constitutional process, they can then structure legitimate processes of participation. But even there, the forms of participation may be very, very different from society to society. In the participatory processes that we've observed, I think we see at least 5 roles emerge, 5 different kinds of players in the process, and maybe a 6th that gets pushed aside eventually. The 6th I'll start with. Quite often we see in our context, the communities in general recognize, geez, these foreign institutions are not working for us. They were imposed on us in the 1930s. What do they have to do with our lives today? And the community will recognize that. We find in general that when the current office holders, the elected officials, take the lead in constitutional reform, it generally doesn't go very far. Not that these individuals are bad of heart necessarily or anything else, but there's a vested interest in the status quo. That status quo is their source of power within the community. And so when we see the status quo office holders or politicians trying to take charge, even when well-meaning, they often get bogged down and don't go very far. What we see that does work, I mentioned maybe 5 roles. We see innovators. We see members of the community who come forward, sometimes in quite radical ways, with ideas for change. We've got to throw off these institutions. We've got to set up a new system. We need to change our methods of elections. We need to, whatever it might be. We see innovators who are dropping new ideas into the community. So the innovators are critical. Secondly, we see negotiators, people in the community using their standpoints of cultural legitimacy to be able to step in and to say, look, I know you and your faction, you think this is the way I ought to go. And I know these other, somebody steps in and tries to play in a good way, a negotiator role. And it may not be a single individual, of course, but individuals who step forward and play roles of negotiators, trying to get to agreement and get past roadblocks that often stand in the way of reform. Third, we see a role being played by educators. I don't mean, sorry to all of us who are professors, I don't mean professors necessarily. By educators, I mean people who can come in and paint pictures, realistic pictures, hopefully, of what's going to come out at the other end. We find a great deal of hesitancy in the communities we work with over, geez, if we change our constitution, what are we going to end up with? We don't have any experience with that new system. And so there's a natural conservatism with a small c, a natural conservatism, a resistance to change because of a fear of the unknown. And these educators in these processes, they might be academics, but most often they're experienced people who have been looking around, if you will, at how Chile did it, or how somebody else did it, or how, looking around and then coming into the community as members of the community and saying, here's what will be the likely results if we take this path. Here will be the likely results if we take this other path. So there's a crucial role for people who are doing that education for the community so that these conversations and community discussions are not in a vacuum of misinformation. Fourth, we see a role for drafters. Somebody actually, in some cases, our constitutions are not written in the context where we work, but they're always drafted, meaning there's someone trying to set forth language, and it's an important task because, as Erin says, this is technology, and if Part A doesn't connect to Part B, you can mess up the technology, and so there's a role for drafters. In our context, we see often excessive reliance on attorneys, And we often say the attorney should come in at the end to try to write down what you really want to do. The attorneys aren't the creators, they're merely the recorders of what the community wants in its constitution. But someone has to basically take the pen or take the keyboard and put words to paper, or at least words to the community, setting forth the key ideas, the key directions, the key clauses of a new document of governance. And lastly, there are the inspirers. These are individuals who glue the community together by, and we see this in very inspiring ways, glue the community together at a time of fundamental change, who can step forward and say, we need to change. We need to create a new narrative for ourselves. We need new institutions by which to make our collective decisions. And those people should not be discounted. They will often be political leaders. They may be out of office political leaders, but someone needs to step forward and basically enunciate and inspire the people to hold together in a time when it's easy to come apart. So those roles of the innovators, the negotiators, the educators, the drafters, and the inspirers are all critical in the processes that we see. So I'll stop there, Archon, and look forward to our discussion.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Joe, for sketching such a informed and structured account of what's happening, and then also inspiring in itself. About, you offered some organic texture of how these things can actually unfold in ways that are really embedded in communities. And that's wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to hand it over to Pedro now, who's going to do the heavy lifting and facilitating the discussion in the Q&A. And we have a bunch of great questions in the Q&A and some in the chat. So please do put your questions and comments in the Q&A, and then we can kind of take them up all together. Thank you. Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Archon. So having a look at the chat, I have clustered the questions in mainly three groups. And the first one, people want to understand how popular participation would actually be moderated by political institutions. And I'm going to start here with a question by Professor Mark Tushnet. He asks if for anyone in the panel if you can discuss or talk something about Alexander Hudson's new thesis, and he's looking at constitution making processes, and he argues that public participation has actually limited the potential to affect the constitutional text, but that the effectiveness of this participation it varies with the political context. And his main argument is that the party's strength is the key factor, is a key moderator. For him, strong political parties, they are unlikely to incorporate public input, while weaker parties, they are comparatively more responsive to public input. So I wonder if anyone in the event, in the panel, would like to comment the role of political parties in an eventual hypothetical constitution-making process in the US, especially because the Democrats and the Republicans are quite strong somehow.
I'm happy to touch on that a little bit as a starting point, and I'm sure it's also highly relevant for Pamela and the Chile process right now as well, particularly given the composition of the Constitutional Convention there. So public participation, and I'm speaking about this in a comparative sense, so not specific to the US, but certainly, as Joe mentioned, all of this sort of learning issue is relevant for the US just like in any other country. So public participation is valuable, it is desirable from a normative perspective, from a rights perspective, from a civic education perspective. But part of the reason there's also, this desirability saying, but people should have a say, they should shape constitutions. And of course, there's risks with this, right? So for many, many years, the academic literature, and I think constitutional reform designers and public leaders have really said public participation is useful, right? It leads to better constitutions. It holds politicians to account during the constitution making process. And that's been very theoretical. We believe it to be true, but it's been very difficult to compare cases and actually look at outcomes. And so that's what Alexander Hudson's book, The Veil of Participation, tries to do. And he's in company with others like Abraxati, and several other researchers that are looking at either comparative cases or individual country cases to sort of say, the public, Iceland, somebody else asked about Iceland is a great example. The public was really engaged. There was a lot of consultations, hundreds of thousands of submissions, but how is this reflected in the constitutional text? Is it at all? And what Alex found, which is really interesting, is that it really depends on the strength of political parties. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing if you have strong parties, which means that a lot of the outcomes of the text are not necessarily changed by the content of public participation, because in sort of a healthy democracy where a strong political party has a solid base, and that implies that party already reflects the interests and needs of their constituency. So the idea that, what I say in my submission to the Constitutional Assembly does not translate into the provision of a constitutional text is not inherently bad. It really, the same issue with the ANC in South Africa, for example. That's a famously participatory case, but really the participation came quite late after a lot of substantive details were already negotiated. But again, if the party, the major party, there were lots of them, of course, really reflected its constituencies' needs and ideas, it's not necessarily bad. So it's to say, this is very complicated. There's not some one-to-one correlation with expanding participation. It doesn't mean that participation is useless. It doesn't mean it doesn't have normative values. And there's other studies, I think one of the Ginsburg and Elkin studies, that shows that the more participatory processes are, you actually end up with constitutions on average that have more robust bills of rights, more democratic and participatory institutions themselves. And so there are these benefits. It's just hard to draw, paint a line from point 1 to point 5. But so I think it is worth looking at Alex Hudson's book on output legitimacy issues, but it's also worth keeping in mind that participation engages with the dynamics of political negotiation. It shapes those dynamics. It holds, it allows politicians to have leverage to say, look, my constituents want this, and here's 10,000 signatures on this proposal, and they can take that to the bargaining table. But again, majoritarian constitution making is not necessarily great either. You don't want mob rule, as Joe suggested. It's not negotiation by 15 million people. It's inputs and ideas to the team that needs to ultimately draft.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm not sure if you want to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, okay. I have a kind of thoughts about that. Because in the case of Chile, the participatory process is not just useful, it's necessary because of the problem of political parties, as Erin said. Chile has been a very stable democracy for the 20th century and from 1989 until now. Many academics studied Chile as a very stable democracy in Latin America, and the question is why we have a so big social unrest in 2019. For many people from the elite was very surprised in 2019 because of people, take the streets to protest from the economy, the political system, and everything. And the reason why is because of the low legitimacy and trust, not just from the political parties, but also the Congress and the government and the armed forces and the church and the, everyone in the elite. People feel so far from the interest of the elite that the people asked to participate. And it's very, strange, because in 2016, when President Bachelet say, well, we can change the constitution through a democratic and institutional process, the political party says, no, we don't need it. But in 2018, 3 years later, people, take the street because they don't have a space to talk inside the political parties, inside the Congress. So I think that in some cases, when you have very unequal societies, as Chile, and other countries, you need to include the people. You need to include social and political actors that are outside the political system. And for example, women, we have just the 20% of the representation of women in the Congress. So we need to include the women, and indigenous people and other kind of people that represented different perspectives of society. And so I think that for legitimacy, for democracy, the participation is necessary in this process.
Thank you very much, Pamela. And a second group of questions, it's highly related to the fear of the constitution-making process being captured by wealthy actors, and these come in very different ways, being answered by different people. And one of the questions is, would a constitutional change actually be able, in terms of outcomes, to change that? Is there a way in which this participatory process would not be captured by wealthy actors? This is up to anyone who is willing to answer the question.
Well, I'll say a word about it in our context that we see. We're seeing some quite innovative measures being taken in these indigenous communities to try to get at that problem. It's a fairly universal human problem that we human beings need the rules of the game, as Erin said. But how do we control and prevent those who have the power at any moment to make and enforce the rules of the game from making and enforcing those rules solely to the benefit of their own factions, their own parties, their own families, their own class? And one of the things we're seeing is what we call the fourth branch of government being instituted in constitutions, in which an oversight function is created, often vested in our case, elders, for example, respected individuals who are not likely to be corrupted by money and power. And very effectively, because they have that cultural legitimacy, they're able to control abuses of power and the capture problem. You might think, well, that's in these relatively small communities, but I would point out that in the United States, for example, without any constitutional foundation for it, we did that with the United States Supreme Court. And we dressed people up in particular polyester black robes and put them in a ceremonial context in order, hopefully, for them to be able to wag their fingers. They actually don't have military might behind them directly, and we count on that to some extent in the U.S. and in many other countries. But we kind of, my view has always been in the United States. The United States kind of just got lucky with that. It fell into it. What we're seeing in our indigenous context is explicit creation of this oversight function in culturally legitimate holders of power and authority that have that ability, notwithstanding the absence of military might behind them, to hold corruption, abuse of power, capture by elites under control.
And just to tack on to that, I mean, again, the US is a particularly tricky case because of the way that money in politics is regulated. I mean, it really has changed a lot in recent years. But again, this is not a problem that's unique to the United States. The threat of elite capture and we're using the word elite pretty loosely. I mean, that means different things in different contexts, right? Do we mean just sort of political party leaderships which have legitimacy because they're, elected, or just the secret wealthy? So part of any constitutional reform process is also negotiating the rules of the process itself, right? So that's what Pamela was really talking a lot about with the Chilean process. So what institution will we use? What are their rules of procedure? How will the public be consulted? How will provisions be voted on? What are the transparency issues? And who gets to make these submissions? So that one of the ways to potentially prevent or mitigate, let's say you can't prevent it, mitigate capture or undue influence is through designing these rules for the process. Our Constitution in the US is a framework constitution. As people have pointed out in the comments, it's very short and it really says very, very little. It sets a baseline for how reform takes place, and you can build up from that. So the legislature can decide to engage this entire sort of parallel process that then kicks back the results to the legislature, and it continues within the Constitution. So it's not a particular solution, but we could certainly limit how things are contributed. We could enhance transparency. You can, there's great innovations of these things called mini publics. So they're random samples or randomly represented groups of the populace that come together over several days or several weeks. They're given neutral information about a range of particular topics. They deliberate and then they sort of produce an outcome. And those can actually really be useful in situations where there's very low trust. They're not decision-making bodies necessarily, although they can be, and there's great examples in around the world of where they contribute to decision-making. But what that can do is if that's publicized, if who those people are, what the process they're going through, and the recommendations, that can help people trust those groups. They trust their fellow citizens. And so then you can see where the mismatches might arise between what the political class chooses to do with those recommendations. It's not a substitute, but I think as Joe was saying, there are these kind of secondary or oversight or fourth branch or additional institutions that you can come up with to mitigate and balance these things.
Thank you very much. I'm going for a final round of questions, and the final cluster is basically looking, is thinking about how to outline the best strategy for a constitutional reform in the US. And given the circumstances, the US is quite divided. It's quite, Professor Marshall Gantz mentioned that it's quite divided, personalistic. What would be the best strategy to make sure that constitutional reform would be effective in the case of the US? A full-on constitutional convention could potentially descend into chaos when dealing maybe with abortion, gun rights, electoral college. Some suggestions in the chat maybe would be the case of the Article 5, in which actually the constitutional amendment, it's going to be created an assembly to propose constitutional amendments to the Constitution of the United States, and this will be done and voted by 2/3 of the legislatures instead of the Senate. Would that be, can this be a good participatory design instead of focusing on Congress, focusing on states? So yeah, general and final comments about what do you think would be a good strategy for participatory constitution building or constitutional reform processes in the US. Please, Erin, you can keep. Yeah, you can keep.
I can see the other speakers on either side of me, so the pointing is probably only my screen, not someone else's. I mean, without getting into sort of specific strategies of the US, at least for the benefit of my job is I get to see lots of different processes, and similar for Joe. I mean, he's comparing hundreds of ways to do this. And actually, given this potential for descent into chaos of a convention is fair. All of these other issues. I mean, people who are interested might actually consider looking at the Ireland process. So there's, we tend to think of constitutional reform as this big revolutionary thing. It needs to be a package. Depending on context, sometimes a big package is necessary. You hammer it out and you get it through. But in particularly divided societies that are not yet or not necessarily in conflict, incremental approaches can be very preferred. Or can be useful. And in Ireland, what they've basically done was establish a series of these mini publics of groups of people that come together, and there's some predefined agenda items. Abortion was one of them in Ireland, where the random people, so weighted random samples, so men and women, people of different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, whatever it is, what the polity looks like, get together and debate these issues, and they come up with proposals. And those, of course, have to process through Congress, through the Parliament. But there's a commitment on the side of the Parliament to look at these, to deal with these. And the process is highly public. It's very transparent. You can get on their website and see the documents that they're looking at, but it is a way to kind of move it a little bit out of the political arena and have citizen deliberation that then gets brought back into the political arena. And it's just quite innovative. It's really interesting. There's a lot of public trust around it. It's not perfect, but it might be an option for the US to look at as a comparative example.
Okay, me? Just from the experience of Chile, I think that there is two things to have in mind. The first one is inclusion of different social actors or political actors in the formal representative institutions. So if you can include the people inside the representative institutions, you have the first steps. And the second one, I think that is to incorporate process of participation and deliberation during the work of the constitutional body or institution. There are many different mechanisms, as Erin says, but you need complement the representation with the participation of the people. That's important because the representation is good, but today people have so much information and also disinformation that you need to have that spaces to debate, to deliberate about the topics and the issues that society really mind.
Pedro, if I might say, contemplating even modest constitutional change in the US is rather a frightening concept at the moment, because you could imagine that just about any process that we might set up, given the nature of current politics, an assembly, to the extent that process started to look like it might have real success, it would be politicked and captured to death by all sides, or at least two sides. And I don't pretend to have the answer to overcoming that. I will point out something that someone in our chat, one of the audience posted or remarked about, and that is the role of citizen education. And here I'm talking about essentially high school civics. There's very interesting research around the world, meaning across all kinds of cultures, that say that when young people are in the ages of sort of 13 to 16 to 17, they're sort of framing themselves as what's it like to be an adult. And if you leave out of that being a citizen, if in other words, if you leave out of their education what it means to be a citizen, you end up with a breakdown of civil dialogue and a breakdown of civility, in fact. And as I say, there's interesting research about this coming from all kinds of countries and cultures around the world. And it's something that in the United States has largely been first abandoned and now taken over by social media in kind of grotesque ways. But it leaves a hole in the polity that's very hard to fill, and something I think that needs some attention. And Arkan, you run a program on citizenship, or at least your professorship has got citizen in it. So.
That's great. Thank you very much, everyone. This is just a great discussion. And it's so rich to have bring to the fore experiences from all around the world with Erin's overview and Joe and Pamela's deep dives. And it just is so generative in terms of bringing to the fore all kinds of ideas about how to solve this extremely difficult and important question of constitutional reform. Just a final thought on Erin's, one low stakes thing that somebody could do, any foundation could do, is just convene a lot of mini publics on constitutional reform. They wouldn't have any authorization or anything, but imagine, for the next 5 or 6 months, once per month, you just randomly select 200 people from across the United States, and they talk about one or other constitutional issue. And so in the chat, somebody said, well, why do you want to change the US Constitution? It's not that long. It's pretty straightforward. But if you did this, if you had one on money and politics, and one on gerrymandering, and one on whether there should be a two-party system or more than two parties, and one on the Electoral College, I bet you'd get some pretty interesting views and conclusions that are pretty far apart from how we practice politics and what the rules are right now. And, 20 years ago, I think we would have had the luxury of saying, constitutional reform, whatever, things are working just great or well enough. But I think that there's the system in the last few years has shown enough cracks so that it's important to entertain some of these ideas that would have seemed far-fetched just not so long ago. And thank you all so much for bringing such wisdom and experience and insight into this complex question of participatory constitutionalism. And thanks everyone for joining in this webinar. And it was a very lively discussion in the Q&A and the chat. And I want to give a shout out to Tova Wang, who was really the intellectual author of this event, as well as to the Ash Center events team, Julianne and Melissa. And thanks everyone for joining in, and please keep tuning into this series.